So, my name is Haley Aguirre. I am Archival Records Clerk at the Sioux City Public Museum, and everybody, I want to once again welcome you back to our first History at High Noon presentation since we've shut down last year. For those of you new to the High Noon program or need a refresher of how this works, because it's been a year, programs last anywhere from 50 minutes to an hour. We try to keep it at 50 minutes. If you need to leave, I understand a lot of you are on lunch break. If you need to leave or go plug your meter, that's just fine. Just go ahead and walk out. I won't be offended or anything like that. We also record these. These are online at our Sioux City Public Museum YouTube channel, and we're recording this live right now. Just so you're aware that this High Noon will be available, as is all of the High Noons that we've done while we've been closed here. So we've been doing a lot of programming, and this one will be online as well. One small note of those of you interested in museum events, upcoming events, we are doing a walking tour of Floyd Cemetery next Saturday. So not this coming Saturday, the Saturday after. That will also be limited and registration just for the safety of everybody involved. So make sure you watch our Facebook page or our email list for that, because that'll be a really good tour. It'll be a lot of fun. So, anywho, let's get to what we've actually here for. So this April marks the 10th anniversary of the museum being in this downtown building. We've been down here 10 years. As of April 23rd, so here next week. And I thought this would be a great time to go through the history of the Sioux City Public Museum. And you reading those dates right, I really mean 1858 all the way up until today. We have a lot of things to cover, and it involves glossing over a lot of details. So let's dive right in. Most of you are familiar with the museum as it was in the Pierce Mansion. However, there was a whole almost century of history of the museum before that, so let's go through that first. The Sioux City Public Museum as a group has its roots in the Sioux City Lyceum, a group that formed in 1858. What is a lyceum? Well, it's a group of people that meet to hear and participate in lectures, academic discussions, and that kind of things. Hey, it's the 1860s. What else is there to do? Some of the topics covered by the Sioux City Lyceum include the should the U.S. acquire Cuba? Should women be allowed to vote? And are all humans one species? As you can see in that 1877 article over there. So those are the kinds of things they're talking about. In 1862, they began securing works for a library, but we have no evidence that they were actually collecting artifacts. That honor goes to the Sioux City Scientific Association, which formed out of the Lyceum in 1885. These guys are doing the same kind of thing, lectures and debates, only now these topics are focused on science, technology, and religion. And in 1877, we know they were granted a room for collections, first in the old Woodbury County Courthouse, in one of the offices there, and then later on in the City Hall Library building, after it was built in 1893. Now, what do I mean by collections? So museums have their roots way back, long before Sioux City, in just a bunch of people who had cool old stuff who wanted to show other people their cool old stuff, either for education or just to say, hey, look at my cool old stuff. So the Cabinet of Curiosities is what this is commonly called in history books. And so when I say donations or collections of the Scientific Association, it's mainly natural history, things like petrified wood, samples of catlinite, jasper, gemstones, minerals, and fossils. One of the most significant donations in this period was the donation of the 69 plesiosaur vertebrae found on the land of D.H. Talbot in modern-day Stone Park. So when you see that on our exhibit out here currently, know that's been with the museum since the 1880s. In 1903, the Scientific Association changed its name to the Academy of Science and Letters. They changed their name to expand their scope. So not only are we doing just lectures and debates, but we're also publishing our own papers and speeches, as well as maintaining a museum and library. So the Academy of Science and Letters was the first institution to have the care of a museum written within its bylaws, at least in Sioux City. There was a 7-member board of directors, including a curator. Parks Commissioner G.B. Healy and Morningside Professor H.C. Powers were among the early curators of the Academy. The collections opened for public viewing in 1906, and again, this is mainly natural history, but among those natural artifacts are Native American relics, which were considered at the time some of the most valuable pieces. In 1907, the collection was valued at over $15,000 and had already outgrown the space allotted to the Academy in the city building. So there were various storage locations all over town. Some were at Morningside College, some were at Sioux City High School, and again, because this is still mostly made of private collections, a lot of those collections were stored still in members' private homes. Some of the artifacts in our collection currently that are attributed to the Academy, again, natural history like mammoth bones and teeth, a pig jawbone, and oreodont skull, but there's some cool historical artifacts in there as well. Here you can see a silver pitcher, which was survived the Garretson Hotel fire of 1914, a axe-shaped old cigar cutter, and a small stool used in Quaker-era Philadelphia. So they're running out of space. In 1920, the Academy was offered space in the public library building at 6th and Jackson Street. This was built in 1913, today called the Carnegie Library. They offered them the Academy space in their 3rd floor in which to display their collections. 1927 was a significant date for the Academy because they hired Gertrude Brown Henderson. She was a historian, a historical writer for the Sioux City Journal, and she was hired first as librarian and then as a curator of the Academy collections. Henderson was very influential because she was the first person to kind of do museum stuff with the Academy collections. So she's cataloging them, saying officially what they are and where they came from, how old they are. She's also collecting historical records of Sioux City itself and preserving Sioux City's history, as well as those artifacts. So we owe a lot of what became our museum, the very foundations of it, we owe to Gertrude Brown Henderson. In the 1930s, during the Depression era, the attendance to both the museum and to the Academy lectures dwindled, and those collections actually closed. They remained closed until 1938, when the Sioux City Lions Club took over care and sponsorship of the Academy collections. They combined those collections with the works of George Inman. George Inman was a collector of Native American artifacts from local tribes and from tribes all across the United States, and combined those two together and founded enough money to reopen the collections to the public. The Lions then passed this sponsorship onto the city. So from 1938, the Sioux City Public Museum has been part of the city of Sioux City. The museum received a lot of help in the 1940s, not least of which from the WPA's Iowa Historical Records Survey. This was a survey done with Iowa museums and libraries, staffed largely by women, to go into these historical locations and to preserve any documents and records that they have. So for here at the museum, among the records preserved were things like the Levering manuscript, written by a Woodbury County pioneer, showing the history of this county, and the works of O.B. Talley. O.B. Talley was an abstractor, and as he was abstracting and surveying lands, he collected histories that he found of those different lands he was surveying. And the WPA took all those little handwritten notes and typed them up onto onion skin. So it's one of our most prized collections of at least archival material in our current collection. Here are some displays at the Carnegie Library in the 1940s. Here you can see a case of Native American artifacts, again, largely from that George Inman collection. Here's a model of the steamboat Omaha presented to the museum in 1939 by the Woodbury County Pioneer Club, and some artifacts from that steamboat era. And one of the most prized artifacts, the giant walnut canoe, which at time was so valuable, it was actually sought after by the Smithsonian, but it was decided it should stay in Sioux City. It is currently on display at the Sergeant Floyd Riverboat Museum. So in 1944, Gertrude Henderson retired and was replaced with a new curator, Lillian Ricketts Smith. I Lillian Ricketts Smith saw immediately this urgent need for space that the museum was having. The museum was very reliant on off-site storage, so things like the Brougham carriage, which had been donated by the Badgerow family in the 1940s, 1947, had to be stored in a barn out on Memorial Drive. We're also receiving a huge flood of donations from World War II soldiers who are coming home and sharing souvenirs from their service and from the places they visited during World War II. And we wanted more space for programming. There wasn't a whole lot of room for things like education or presentations or lectures or things like that in the space that we were taking up in the library, so we wanted to expand that as well. The public library also wanted their building back because their collection was growing exponentially as well. So the museum really needed its own home that it itself could just occupy. Luckily, there was one such home available, even if the Des Moines Register doesn't know how much it cost. And so now we move into the Pierce Mansion years, 1959 to 2010. For those of you unfamiliar with the mansion's timeline, it was built in 1893 by John Pierce, and in 1900 it was sold to William Barber via raffle. From 1902 to 1907 it was owned first by William Gordon and then Dr. J.N. Warden until 1908 when it was purchased by the T.S. Martin family. They lived there until 1920, and then throughout the 20s there were kind of various owners and some vacancies thrown in there until 1928 when the house was purchased by T.S. Martin's oldest son, J. Earl Martin. His family lived there until 1946, then it became the home of Martha Zanfis and all of her antiques. And from 1951 to 1957, it had served as the home of the nurses of the Lutheran Hospital. And now comes the hero of the early Pierce Mansion years, the Junior League. They purchased the museum the Pierce Mansion in February 1959 for $10,000 and gave it to the city entirely free of charge, with the caveat that they were going to use that house as a cultural institution. They also gave $3,000 in moving expenses and salary expenses for the museum staff that was going to be responsible for moving the museum to its new home. Now, the mansion was a good solution. It was not a perfect one. It quadrupled the space that the museum had been taking up in the library, but it was in vast need of repairs. The roof was leaky, the electrical system was outdated, and the building was not anywhere up to fire code. So that giant sprinkler pole that you can see in the mansion's current main staircase, this was installed around that time to bring the building up to fire code. City budget constraints also limited the amount that the city could put forward to help the museum move. So the museum was almost entirely reliant on its own staff and volunteers and volunteer groups. So our moving crew, the Junior League, not only furnished the building and all the money, but not all the money, but most of it. They also donated their labor in fixing the mansion up and moving the stuff into the museum's new home. Hansen Glass and Paint Company moved a lot of the more fragile artifacts, as well as some of the glass for the cases. Woodbury County Labor Council provided a lot of people to come in and help move cases, move artifacts, and what have you. And the Pierce Van Lines, of course, donated trucks. The grand opening of the museum was September 11th, 1960, and with our new home, we got a new system of government. Now, the museum would be headed not by a curator, but by a director, who is then subject to a museum board of trustees. With some changes through the years, this is pretty much how our museum runs today. Our first director at the Pierce Mansion was Charles DeBusk, who you can see there at the far right, and he's shown either with an early board of trustees or members of city council or both. I'm not entirely sure, the picture wasn't clear, but he's shown there in the Pierce Mansion's Pioneer Room. Some exhibits in the early 1960s. The Northwest Room, which is what's called the Breakfast Room now, was kind of the everything room. It held temporary exhibits. It held some rotating displays. Here you can see it's full of antique china, dolls, and some pioneer objects. And this would be the main temporary gallery for the museum. The Pioneer Room on first floor, featuring the giant buffalo head, allegedly shot by Buffalo Bill. That was donated as the museum was moving, and it is currently on display in our Siouxland attic. The Pioneer Room's log cabin was donated in 1963 by the Sioux Gun Club. It had been their cabin out at McCook Lake. So yes, when you see that cabin, which is still on display in our current gallery, those are real logs, and it was really used as a shelter house for the gun club. Now, originally, the Native American Hall was on the first floor because the third floor wasn't done yet. And so here are some of those displays in the early 60s when it's on first floor. Also on display opening day were artwork made by Winnebago artist Chuck Raymond. His drawings featured a lot of museum artifacts that are part of our Native American collections, as they would have been used by Native Americans in their time. So those were also on display opening day, and they're still currently on display in our temporary hall right past the rock room. Some other events in the early 60s. In 1961, the Sioux City Museum and a Historical Association was created. This association is a volunteer group, and it not only promotes public interest in the museum, but it acts as a sponsoring body to things like grant writing, certain programs, or sometimes even certain staff changes. They're kind of just the main launching off point for anything financial that we need. So they're kind of our unsung heroes, the Sioux City Museum and Historical Association. And they're, of course, still around today. In January of 1962, we launched the Rumsey Historical Project. This was a call out for Sioux City historical documents. Any documents, any collections that people had that would document Sioux City's history. This was named after Mary Pendleton Rumsey, who donated $10,000 to the museum in her will. The archives on third floor was named after Rumsey. They were called the Rumsey Historical Room, where research and archives were stored. And the front room of our museum's research center still bears the name Rumsey Historical Room. One of the major donations under the Rumsey Historical Project was the donation of the works and artifacts of Governor William Harding. He was governor of Iowa, and he was from here in Sioux City. The new home also offered more opportunities for educational programming. Not only were there lectures and classes, like the geology class that you can see here, but there were also outreach programs to bring museum artifacts and museum education into Sioux City schools. Here you can see some artifact kits. These were designed in 1964, and they were also designed to coincide with elementary school curriculum, so kids could see artifacts from the museum up close and personal with these kits. Now, Charles DeBusk retired in 1965, and he was replaced with William Schwarting. He had an extensive museum background, and his vision for the museum was to create more hands-on learning experiences using museum artifacts. He wanted the museum to be a place that was more than just staring at stuff behind glass. And nobody exemplifies that better than Schwarting's daughter, Julie, shown here standing next to our museum's giant clamshell. In 1966, Schwarting petitioned several government bodies and boards of education to increase our educational programming, not only increase the variety of programs, but to increase who was being impacted by those programs. So he contacted boards of education in 6 local counties, and so now kids from all over Siouxland were coming to the museum to participate in our programs. By 1967, we had 5,200 children being served in some way by museum tours and education. Under Schwarting, the museum acquired many live specimens as well, turtles, salamanders, and even a giant python. These were used in educational classes called Touch and See, where kids could actually handle these live specimens, as you can see here. Under Schwarting, exhibits preparator Bill Diamond was absolutely instrumental as far as exhibits and education. He taught classes in lapidary, which is gem and stone cutting and fitting gems into clothing, as well as classes on minerals and microbiology. True to his title, he also designed most of the museum's exhibits. Here you can see the Rock and Mineral Hall, designed in 1968. The Prehistoric Life Hall, designed in 1969. And the Civil War Room, also designed in 1969 by Bill Diamond, featuring that little howitzer cannon, again, right out in front on the floor where kids could touch it and interact with it, emphasizing Schwarting's dream of hands-on learning. In 1969, the museum had its first antique car show. Car enthusiasts from all over Sioux City and Siouxland brought their antique cars up to the mansion's lawn to be gawked at by any passersby. This is still a very popular part of our museum's programming today. Now, Schwarting retired in 1970, and he recommended Bill Diamond as his replacement. Bill Diamond actually had no official museum degree, but he had been serving under Schwarting since 1967, and Schwarting insisted that there was no better man for the job. Very early into Diamond's directorship, we had one of the worst thefts that we've ever had in Sioux City Museum history. 18 unique firearms were stolen from their cases, totaling about $2,500. Among these firearms that were stolen were 8 Civil War carbines. This one that you can see here, still part of our collection, was actually found in an alleyway right behind the museum. The Sioux City Museum and Historical Association sponsored a drive to replace these stolen artifacts. In 1974, the Sioux City Public Museum achieved accreditation with the American Association of Museums. That sounds really, really boring, but it was a really big deal at the time because we were only one of 6% of all museums in the nation to have accreditation with this institution, and we were the 5th museum in Iowa to be accredited. This opened up the Sioux City Public Museum for more funding, as well as traveling exhibits from other accredited institutions. Today, the Sioux City Public Museum has accreditation both with the AAM and the IMA, or the Iowa Museum Association. The Sioux City History Hall on first floor opened in September of 1975, so now the Sioux City Public Museum actually had exhibits devoted to Sioux City history. This was also designed by Bill Diamond, obviously. Here are some displays in the Sioux City History Hall featuring the PV Grand Opera House, the Corn Palaces, and again, that Steamboat Omaha model from the Woodbury County Pioneer Club. So the Native American Hall was moved up into 3rd floor and given the new case treatment where cases were built into the walls, and you can see that walnut canoe hanging up above the rafters there. Speaking of redesigned exhibits, Bill Diamond redesigned and opened most of the Sioux City Public Museum exhibits in the early 1970s, and with some minor changes here and there, and sometimes exhibits were moved. This was pretty much how the mansion looked until it was relocated in the 2000s. The Natural History Halls opened in the early 1970s. Here you can see Life on Land, featuring stuffed birds and mammals from all around Iowa. Life on the Water, featuring some waterfowl and celebrating the life in our rivers and ponds. The Pioneer Hall was given the new case treatment and given some new wood paneling so stuff could be hung all up and around the walls. And here's a shot of the main lobby. I think this is actually from the 90s, but again, things didn't change all that much, not totally. The Sioux City History Hall and the gift shop is just off to your left there. As far as education goes, the museum partnered with the Area 12 Education Agency to increase our educational programming. So by 1971, we were serving over 9,000 students in a wide variety of classes. That Touch and See program was still very, very popular, as with all the reptiles and live specimens. And the program actually expanded to allow kids to handle museum artifacts as well. The museum also offered a variety of adult education classes. Bill Diamond still taught those beginning and advanced lapidary courses, but there were also courses in stitchery, mineral identification, astronomy. We had guests come in to talk about antique glass and identifying antique photographs. All kinds of education classes were available. They also sponsored bus trips out to out-of-state museums like St. Louis and Chicago. So that was another program available for adults. In 1979, the Pierce Mansion was nominated to the National Register of Historic Places by the Department of the Interior. This opens up the mansion to achieve more federal funding for its preservation. And boy, did it need it. Again, the mansion was not a perfect solution, and we knew that when we moved in. In 1973, there was rotten wood found in a lot of the mansion's walls, and the museum had to actually be closed for a time. In 1978, it was discovered that some exterior stone was falling away, and so we had to block off part of the mansion there while that was refinished. And we were still reliant on off-site storage. In 1978, there was water damage to a set of Sioux City journals that had been stored in the municipal auditorium. When people realized that those were museum pieces, they're like, well, what were they doing at the auditorium? And their museum responded, we don't have the space to put them here. Here you can see the Pierce Mansion's attic, completely stuffed with stuff the second it was opened, pretty much. And again, that off-site storage, we had a lot of vehicles and other large artifacts, like the Brome carriage, stored at the old Sioux City Air Base. So what the museum really needed was a giant building, ideally with some historical significance, that could offer a lot of room for displays and a lot of room for storage. Luckily, Sioux City had a giant high school that had closed in 1972. The idea of moving the public museum into the castle had been first proposed in 1978. However, the main campaign actually began in 1983. The linchpin of this idea was a cultural center that would combine the Art Center, the Sioux City Symphony Orchestra, and the Sioux City Public Museum all in one building. Great idea in theory, but the castle needed a lot of help. Preliminary studies were shown on how much it would actually take to renovate the castle, and for just the museum's preliminary cost, it was estimated around $300,000. That was to free up 20,000 square feet of space, which would just shy of double their space in the mansion. For the whole kit and caboodle for the entire castle, it was going to cost around $4 million to repair all 640,000 square feet of space. But people were pretty optimistic. The Castle on the Hill Association was formed. This was a volunteer group made up mostly of Central alumni in charge of fundraising for the project, as well as planning and other things. McDonald Carey was hired as the head of the Museum to the Castle project. He himself was a Central grad and had been involved in a lot of movies on Hollywood, so we got some star power behind the project. And the goal was to raise $1.5 million by 1985, with the new museum open in 1988. Now, where was this money going to come from? Well, they knew they could rely on some grants and some corporate contributions, but they also knew that the bulk of the money was going to have to come from individual gifts, largely also from Central alumni. Here's some design proposals as to what the new museum inside of the castle was going to look like. Here's the space the museum would have occupied. One of the class hallways turned into a exhibits area and an archival area in one of the classrooms. So by 1985, we had $250,000 raised. So, but people were still like, oh, you know, it's just going to take longer than we thought. Everything's still okay. That was until 1989. When a new study was published that revealed that the castle was going to be a lot more expensive than they thought. Not $4 million, but $7.5 million. A bond referendum was released by the city in August of 1989, and it was soundly defeated. And seeing the survey, you can kind of see why. Public opinion on this move to the castle was really, really split. Some people loved this idea of turning the castle into something useful for Sioux City, but other people thought the move was just way, way too expensive. So the museum is not sitting idle while all this castle stuff is going on. In 1980, we had our first Siouxland Collects exhibit. This featured the collections of 9 different antique collectors here in Sioux City. Here you can see Bob Post's beer memorabilia on display in 1986. In December 1982, we had our first holiday open house. During the holiday open house, the mansion is all decorated with nice Christmas decorations. There's refreshments. Guest choirs come to sing. And the first one of those was held in 1982 and still continues at the mansion today. In July of 1984, we held the Frontier Fair. This was part of Rivercade and celebrated Sioux City's pioneer and frontier history. Demonstrations at the fair included pioneer cooking, candle making, there were pottery classes, displays of Native American art, and even the firing of an antique war cannon. However, the biggest thing to suffer in the 1980s were the educational programs. Major city budget constraints limited the amount they could fund educational programming, and a lot of the museum's fundraising and funds were all caught up in that whole castle business. So the museum saw an increased reliance on volunteers and interns for what programs it could offer. Here you can see Becky Avery showing some Native American artifacts to some students on our third floor. So now what? We couldn't move into the castle. We're seeing some cuts in educations. What are we going to do now? So in March of 1990, a planning project was launched, headed by former Art Center director David West, that pretty much turned to the public and said, what do you want from us? What do you want us to do? What future do you see for the Sioux City Public Museum? The survey results came back, and the major points were more hands-on exhibits, revive those education programs, bring the artifacts back into Sioux City schools, and to continue to hold events beyond exhibits, to create the museum as a place where we're more than just a collection of stuff. We're a vital part of the community. That's all well and good, but it really emphasized the need that we need to get out of the mansion as soon as possible. There was another push to put the museum in the castle in the early 90s. The linchpin of this idea was called Castle America. This was going to turn Old Central High School into a major tourist destination with a giant IMAX theater and like live recreations of city streets and giant models of Sioux City buildings and all this stuff. Very, very, very ambitious. But by September of '96, the castle was just going to be way too expensive to try to renovate for the museum, and the drive was ended by the Board of Trustees. So in the 1990s, Bill Diamond retired at the end of 1992. He was replaced with his former curator and assistant director, Scott Sorensen. Sorensen retired in 1996. Diamond was called back to serve as interim director until the fall of '96 when Craig Olson was hired. And Olson's vision for the museum was like, okay, we're not going to get a new home anytime soon. What can we do to improve what we have? One of the coolest temporary exhibits in this time was called Getting the Picture. This was held in 1991 and featured memorabilia and artifacts from Sioux City's local TV personalities. At the end of this exhibit, there was a big panel held where all of those TV personalities came and talked to the public, answered questions, and all that stuff. So Jim Henry, Earl Gruskin, Al Smith, Don Stone, all these guys came into the museum, and it was a very, very popular public event. 1992 was the showing of the fourth grade history projects. Sioux City fourth graders study Sioux City history as part of their curriculum, and they make models and posters showing about different parts of Sioux City history. And so the first time they were displayed in our museum was in 1992, and they've been since displayed every spring. They're actually on display right now in that giant temporary hall behind you, so go check it out. So notable donations in this time period, because, you know, even with the space issues, we're still collecting stuff. In 1993, we received the 1901 Oldsmobile, currently on display in our gallery. This is considered Sioux City's first automobile. And in 1994, we got the pointers of Tom Peterson. He was a weatherman and was famous for using a variety of wacky objects for his pointers. The museum has a large collection of these pointers. I think we have pretty much all of them except for a handful that were kept by his family. In In 1994, there was an event called Dynamation. This was actually held at Katy Station, but all of the setup and tours were handled by museum staff and volunteers. This was so popular and featured giant animatronic dinosaurs that moved and roared and all of that cool stuff. And it was so popular that it was repeated in 1996 with Ice Age animals. But the biggest push in this period was the increase of our education programs. Here you can see a lot more workshops were opened in a variety of different topics, including dinosaurs. These are 2 dinosaur workshops led by Janet Finzen and Kitty Tobin Grotenhuis. Speaking of Janet Finzen, she also brought artifacts back into Sioux City schools. Here you can see her with some Native American artifacts showing 3rd graders at Hunt Elementary. But this need for space issues did not go away, and so now we enter the era of what I call 1 museum in 4 facilities. In August '97, the Lauren Callender Museum opened in the newly remodeled City Hall clock tower. This featured historic images and some artifacts cases as well, including a model railroad by Blair Shaquin. And most recently, it is now the home of the Abraham Lincoln statue that was once at Central High School. In January '98, the Sergeant Floyd Riverboat Museum and Welcome Center became part of the Sioux City Public Museum. This had actually opened all the way back in '89. However, it was brought into the museum in '98. When the Welcome Center opened in 1989, the host Blair Shaquin, who was a historian of the Missouri River and Sioux City in general, he designed a lot of the exhibits, and a lot of those exhibits also featured museum artifacts. In July of 2000, we had the opening of the Pearl Street Research Center. This facility at 407 Pearl Street offers some more space not only for the grossly overcrowded archives and research area, but some 3D collection storage as well. Here you can see the front room of the Museum Research Center. This was held a workroom for researchers, volunteers, as well as the archival storages and offices for the archives. And on second floor, you can see the very overstuffed 3D collection storage at the Pearl Street location. Some other cool stuff in this time period. In '97, the George Newman negatives were donated. Newman was a journal photographer in the baby boom era, and his negatives are just gorgeous. If you've seen a History at High Noon presentation, you have definitely seen some of Newman's negatives. In 2000, speaking of History at High Noon, we had the start of the Tuesday Twilight Talks. These were panel discussions on different topics of Sioux City history. Here you can see one in 2003, and the panel is made up of staff member Matt Anderson, Tom Munson, who at the time was a intern in work study, Grace Linden, and Tom Johnston, who was a volunteer. But the museum really had to move somewhere. And so finally, in December of 2001, Steve Hansen was hired as the museum director, and he almost immediately put in moving budgets into the city and museum budgets in the next coming years. His view for the museum was he didn't want exhibits to just be hands-on, he wanted them to be minds-on. So not only are you interacting with history, interacting with all these artifacts, but you're actually getting something out of it and learning something through doing. And ideally, he wanted the museum downtown because that would make it easily accessible to both locals and tourists alike. Here you can see Steve presenting an award in 2007 to Stan Evans. Evans was very influential in the Museum to the Castle project, as well as the Sergeant Floyd Riverboat Museum. All right, so we're gonna put the museum down. Where's it gonna go? In 2004, 2 plans were submitted. One to build a new structure by the Art Center, which was gonna cost like $9 million, and one to remodel the first floor of JCPenney, which was gonna cost like $3 million. No-brainer. In 2005, the Penny's plan was adopted, and the city purchased the building in December. It ended up, of course, being a lot more than $3 million, but I won't go into that. And thus we enter the era of the museum downtown. In 2006, conceptual meetings were held as to what exactly this new museum was going to be. The designers Hilferty and Associates, who designed this whole place, really from the very beginning was asking public opinion, what are the exhibits going to look like? How interactive are they? Who's using them? What programs do you want? Yada, yada, yada. So from the very beginning, this museum was designed with the public in mind. Highlighting that need for space, in 2007, the large artifacts and some of our larger collections were moved to the new site simply for storage because there wasn't anywhere else to put them. So right over in that area, there was a giant plywood box where we had things like the buckboard, the iron lung, the Brougham carriage, and all that stuff. And they were stored here while the museum was being constructed. June 2009 was an open house, not only showing off the new designs, but showing off some of those larger artifacts that had been with the museum forever, but nobody had gotten to see them because there just wasn't space to display them. Here you can see one of those designs. This was designed for what is now our disaster wall, one of the early designs for it, and the fire hose cart, which was one of those large artifacts that nobody ever got to see because there wasn't room. September 2009, construction began both on the interior and exterior levels. Here's a shot from April 2010 showing the steel going up in our theater. You're standing in the disaster wall area looking towards the entrance. June 2010 was the installation of the Paver, this absolutely massive giant orange thing, is what I tell the kids. You can see what it used to look like and what it looked like after it was restored. It was loaded onto a flatbed trailer and hauled down here and then driven right through the wall, right through our big overhead door. Here you can see the Paver's original owner, Irving F. Jensen Jr., helping to drive it into the museum. He donated a lot of the vehicles for this museum and was a major, major benefactor. I didn't have good shots of the Paver going in because it was so dusty. All the dust was flying around the camera. But what they did was they laid these giant plywood planks down under the caterpillar treads and then just kind of inched the Paver slowly to where it sits now. And then everything in our exhibits was built around it. Also in June 2010, we had the Carrie Keene Coupe, or our small little biplane. When that was moved here, the top wings were actually taken off, and then it was hauled here and then reassembled. And here you can see being lifted onto those big, strong, sturdy cables so it can hang where it currently does, above our gallery. Here's a shot of us moving out of the Pearl Street location in September 2010. The museum received a lot of help from local groups and organizations and schools. And here you can see students at Bishop Healing Catholic High School helping us move out of Pearl Street. And here's all the stuff located in the new research center in October 2010. All these boxes have to be still out because we're still scanning photos and still submitting things to Hilferty as this museum is being constructed. In October 2010, the fire truck came in, same story with the Paver. It was driven right into its location, and then all of the structure was designed around it. Oh, so close. Here's February 2011 with a lot of the attic in place. We're just kind of waiting on labels, and you can see our little trunk getting constructed there for our ghost in the mirror. Here's a crew packing up the Pierce Mansion in March of 2011. This is Phyllis Holzrichter, Tom Munson, John Moose, and Matt Shaquin. And finally, April 23rd, 2011, opening of the museum downtown. There was a big event held back here in the temporary halls where food from local vendors was served and there were speeches and all that good stuff. But of course, the highlight was getting to walk around this brand new museum downtown. Here's a shot from farther back near the kiosk that highlights Gateway and IBP. You can see the bucket for the Paver there. The Sioux City History projects for 2011 were on display at the new location, and so they were right there where they currently are in our temporary hall. Ted Waite and the Waite family were other major benefactors of our museum. Our Corn Palace Theater is actually named after Joan Gaston Waite. I can't list all the benefactors, so if you're super, super curious, go check out our donor wall right by the entrance. And the show goes on. Boy, it's been a great 10 years. The Big Dig, one of our most popular attractions, though it's currently closed due to COVID, was first installed in 2012. Here, children can dig for dinosaur bones around a bunch of fake sand. We have 2 temporary halls that always feature different rotating exhibits all the time. Some of them are made in-house, like this Tommy Bolin one from 2012. But a lot of them we get from other institutions like the Mid-America Arts Alliance, like this Coney Island one from 2017. The Tuesday Twilight Talks became History at High Noon. Here you can see a bunch of people in 2012 in our classroom. These high noons became so popular that we moved them out here to our temporary hall. During spring tour season, around 2,500 students from Sioux City and the surrounding area come through our museum for tours. Here you can see Rosie Cuny showing students the fire hose cart in 2014. Our summer classes and programs are always a huge hit with kids. Here you can see one of our NASA programs where kids make paper rockets and then stomp on pop bottles to launch them, and they launch them all the way across this gallery and sometimes over into the loading dock area. So yeah, they get some good air. Also in the summer, IPTV brings Clifford the Big Red Dog to come and teach kids the joys about reading. And I don't want to get too personal, but Clifford and I are very close. During the summer and fall, we have walking tours of Sioux City neighborhoods and Sioux City cemeteries. Self-guided tours are also available. We have little brochures, so if you're interested in those, go ask at the front desk. Here you can see a shot of Floyd Cemetery in 2019, where we had over 100 attendees. And again, we're doing Floyd Cemetery again next Saturday, so make sure you watch for registration for that. Also in the fall, we have our Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead program. This features crafts, altars or ofrendas made by students and families of Irving Elementary School, as well as performances by the La Perla Tapatía dancers. Once the museum moved out, the Pierce Mansion was converted into a period home and is available for rentals. It is staffed by an absolutely amazing group of volunteers and still hosts the annual holiday open house. The Sergeant Floyd Riverboat Museum and Welcome Center hosts the Antique Car Show because there's more space down there. That Antique Car Show was renamed to honor our former director, Bill Diamond. It also hosts the annual Lewis and Clark encampment. But of course, we're a museum, and so the bulk of our business is our collections. I won't go through all these numbers, but from the early Academy catalog, we just had, a few hundred artifacts, plus the ones from Georgia Inman. From a 1970 inventory, we had around 9,500 3D artifacts, 100 linear feet of archives. A linear foot is just how much paper can fit into a foot of shelf space. It's a lot easier than counting individual pieces of paper. And 4,200 photos. Modern estimates are way, way above that. 100,000 3D artifacts, 3,600 linear feet of archives, and around 2 million photos, about half of which now are born digital. From 2009 to 2020 fiscal year counts, we receive an average of 253 donations every year, or around 9,200 artifacts. What happens to all these donations? Well, a lot of them are processed by our volunteers. Here you can see the Research Center volunteers and interns. They put in over 120 hours every single week in collections and processing management. Speaking of our volunteers, our annual volunteer dinner pays homage to all of our volunteers, both at the in the museum and in the Research Center and in the Pierce Mansion. Absolutely nothing you have seen in this show today would have been possible without this absolutely amazing host of people who volunteer their time for our museum. From March to June 2020, the Sioux City Public Museum was closed to the public due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We reopened July 7th with appropriate safety measures in place, requiring masks, encouraging social distancing, having hand sanitizer stations throughout our museums, all things we're far too familiar with now. And we've done our best to keep up with public demand. Tours, History at High Noons, and other programs had gone virtual. We've had our Kids Days every month where kids can take crafts home rather than be out here in the public. It's a kind of a Make on Our Kids Thursdays. And of course, this all culminates with finally having History at High Noon back in person once again. So to all of you that have supported the museums throughout the years, to all of you that have watched our stuff online during the pandemic, and to all of you here today, I want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for continuing to make the Sioux City Public Museum a place where history happens every day.